In the 1920s, B.J. Palmer discerned that there were two types of spinal cord tension patterns. One he called the single effect nerve pressure. The single effect nerve pressure was where a particular nerve was involved, most likely associated with a subluxation or misalignment, where the distortion was more at that one level associated with the intervertebral foramina. He said that that is a minimal type of impact on the individual compared to multiple cord tensions or pressures. The multiple cord tensions or pressures, he said, had to be the priority of the chiropractor, and that the multiple cord tension pressures associated with the stretching of the spinal cord. In Stevenson's textbooks, probably the greatest chiropractic philosophy book written by R.W. Stevenson, summarizing Palmer's work, first edition I think was 1926 or 7, and next one was about 20 years later. In the etiology section, B.J. Palmer said that there are 4 reasons or 4 mechanisms of subluxation. One was circumferential constriction. Circumferential constriction. Basically, for example, the atlas would move and the circumference of the foramen magnum would be altered. Pressure on the nerve. The second was a torqued meningeal occlusion, a twisting or mechanical tension pattern, a twisting or torquing of the meninges. The third was heat expansion meningeal occlusion, where the acute situation there would be swelling in the meninges. And the fourth one was most chronic. That was the case where scar tissue actually formed and actually would cause a interference in the spinal cord and transmission of mental impulses. Well, when you think about that, other than the actual circumferential constriction, pressure on nerve, 3 of the reasons of spinal cord interference and subluxation were associated with a distortion or tension, mechanical tension meninges. What you'll find out a little bit later in this session is that the mechanical pressure, the actual mechanical pressure, the pressure on the nerve itself, compressive effect, really winds up having a stretching elongation effect on the individual nerves and on the nerve system and the spinal cord. Now, in 1924, I believe it was, Dasa Evans developed the neurocoulometer. And it's really based upon 2 dissimilar metals forming a thermocouple. And as it was run along the spine, the temperature differential would set up a difference in the expansion of the metals, produce an electrical signal, and it would be read in a horseshoe galvanometer would read that as a peak in a reading. Hottest spot would go to one side on the right, or the hottest spot would go to the left. These peaks were developed as patterns. And Palmer said that just because the vertebral area is misaligned or shows to be distorted on X-ray doesn't mean it needs to be adjusted. We need to see, is the body stuck or fixated in a particular pattern of behavior? Now, why is this so important? One of the reasons why this is so significant is the model of chiropractic has been, and very often is still now, a 3-dimensional model that is height, width, depth, and space. It's coming from here. This is the subluxation. This is how we're going to adjust it mechanically. And what Palmer was introducing is a 4th-dimensional quality, which 4th dimension includes time. And he said that basically you want to adjust when the person's in a pattern, a fixated pattern, rather than a dynamic pattern of behavior. And that the pattern of behavior, the dynamic pattern of behavior, is really the natural state. So what was really happening is that the concept of time in the picture, the concept of oscillation involves time over a period of time. The D.T. Palmer spoke about molecular oscillation being the basis of consciousness. And when in 1931, Palmer actually released the subluxation specific adjustment specific, the HIO hole-in-one adjustment, He used the instrumentation to determine the timing of when to adjust. And what was really phenomenally interesting is he suggested that the one place that all the mechanical cord tension could develop, and where the one place if a chiropractor would adjust could affect the whole spinal cord and the connection between brain and body, innate educated intelligence, would be in the upper cervical spine. And the force application suggested was a toggle recoil adjustment. Watching paper in a paper mill in the Davenport, he noticed that the actual paper got cut not by the first time the blade descended, but on the recoil. With a hammer, it is the recoil that makes a difference. So he realized that the oscillation somehow would be better perceived by the intelligence than actual other types of additional thrusts. And that innate, with the oscillation, with the center percent into oscillatory motion, would understand the language of that and would actually create the subluxation correction or the adjustment. I'm mentioning all of this because I'm going to be speaking now about adverse mechanical spinal cord tension. Actually from the book Adverse Mechanical Tension in the Central Nervous System by Alf Brigg, neurosurgeon, written in 1978. You may ask, well, how did I come to that idea to look at Alf Brigg? And that's a great question. I'm glad I asked it. My first network seminars, actually, were 1984, April 1984, and they followed articles in the Digest of Chiropractic Economics in 1983. And the first issue, the first article, I introduced network chiropractic spinal analysis, a network of the aspects of different techniques that really unified chiropractic concepts and techniques by realizing that there were two types of subluxations. And I borrowed this by the inspiration by Palmer's concept of the single effect nerve pressure and the multiple cord tensions. And I called the single effect nerve pressure the structural subluxation, the structural vertebral subluxation. And here the vertebra is misaligned on its articulation, causing an efferent response, alteration in nerve, in actually a mental impulse flow through the nervous system. I found that those people and those chiropractors techniques who address that usually address the posteriority of the vertebra, more often the fixation of the high transverse, and went to use the bony lever to realign it on its articulation. And many of those practices looked at the physical cause of subluxations. I then said there's a meningeal subluxation inspired by the model of multiple cord tensions, for which Palmer wanted to take the upper cervical spine as a one place with no bony blocks, that the oscillatory force could have the greatest effect in self-adjusting or correcting the multiple cord tensions and the consequence of that. And this meningeal subluxation, I found chiropractors to address that usually went for inferiority, anteriority, or superiority adjustment, and use a toggle recoil adjustment or a terminal point drop piece or an instrument adjusting or sustained gentle contact or even blocks to allow the respiratory rhythm to make a change. So with this, I said my whole purpose of my first network seminar was simply this. Well, we first want to correct the meningeal subluxations before you go for structural, because the spinal cord is actually in the wrong place and everything else you're doing is most likely compensations. And by addressing a compensation, basically it may be increasing the primary distortion, someplace in the meningeal system. Now, how did I get to Alf Brigg, as I mentioned before? Well, after my first seminar, some chiropractors wrote to me. Some attended the seminar and some wrote to me who read further articles that I wrote and said, you might be interested in looking at the work of Lowell Ward, who developed stressology, spinal stressology, and his model was really based upon the actual mechanisms and the research of Alf Brigg, neurosurgeon, looking at the spinal cord tension and looking at the length of the spinal cord from the foramen magnum all the way down to the coccyx. And what's really interesting is he had gone into prisons and looked at people who were found guilty of certain crimes, and he actually was able to look at angular movements and angular distortions and mechanical tension patterns mathematically and predict what type of crime the person had and whether innocent or guilty, etc. There was no real evidence, journals written that this was written in, but it was really fascinating to me how a person's personality could be read through the spine through mechanical tension patterns. Well, I decided to study Alf Brigg's work, and I found Alf Brigg's work helped me understand even more what Palmer was saying back in 1920s about the mechanical tension in the spinal cord and the meningeal subluxation, what I called. I then changed the name meningeal subluxation a few years later to facilitated subluxation because basically some chiropractic boards in there, how could I put it in there, lack of enough altitude academically or understanding, we're saying that if I'm addressing a meningeal subluxation, I must be practicing medicine because chiropractors can't affect the meninges. I really wasn't quite sure what to say to that when indeed they were asking people to do neurological orthopedic tests, which have the main impact on stretching the meninges and having a positive result if somewhere between the foramen magnum and the dural sleeve there's inappropriate ability to transfer mechanical forces through the meninges. So I call it facilitated subluxation. Facilitated subluxation still goes back to the concept of the fourth dimension of time because the system is still facilitated from an event that may have happened a long time ago that where the stressor is no longer needed to be there. So this is what Alf Briggs said about adverse mechanical cord tension. It is, quote, a tension set up in the brain, spinal cord, and nerve roots through the presence of a pathological structure or lesion located within or outside the tissue, which is a predominant cause of neurological signs and symptoms. I modified that to be a condition of the spinal cord and its soft tissues produced by various factors which contraction, elongate, or compress the spinal cord, interfering with its function, tension, oscillation, and compromising its physiology, thus predisposing the central nervous system and peripheral nerves to a state of facilitation, and the facilitation leading to such tension. So this actually is a broader model which actually can really affect both models of vertebral subluxation in this model. And it's also, what's different is BJ's writing said subluxations really were efferent responses. And I believe and I sense that the facilitated subluxation is more of an afferent phenomenon. And that's where facilitation of the system, either through conflict of a person's life, can lead to the mechanical tension in the system. So what is this mechanical tension? What is it like? Well, there's a slide here you'll see of the effects of flexion extension on the spinal cord. And when you look at the central pictures from an autopsy there, you'll see the spinal nerves, and you'll see the little loop under it, which is the dentate ligament. Please remember the dentate ligament are strips of PIA attached to the dura that exit between the anterior and posterior cords, and somewhere between 18 and 25, usually, pairs along the spinal cord. Palmer had spoken about that and said that some of the effect of the mechanical tension of the spinal cord was due to the tension actually exerted on the dentate ligament. And basically, if dentate ligaments contract unequally, there can be a lateral pulling of the spinal cord and with a lateral distortion. The flexion extension of the spinal cord is associated with the flexion extension of the whole cord or elements of it. That's associated with a flexion extension in the ankles, which means the heel tension or lack of compliance in the motion of the ankles. And during care, we watch to see at what point does the ankle really move in flexion extension or lateral bending as it's going to self-regulate itself. On the picture on the left, the lateral view of the spine, you see the spinal cord relaxed. With it, the blood vessels or the perivascular clefts within the spinal cord really are able to be nice and opened with a nice blood supply and nourishment.